Hi,
Hi,
everyone.
everyone.
Hi, everybody.
Hello.
Hi. Well, welcome everybody to the Shin-Nikkei experience. My name is Hiro from Nikkei Rising, Tadaima's young adult committee of sorts. Today I have with me Mia Russel, Kurt Ikeda, and Setsuko Winchester, who are all Shin-Nikkei role models of mine within the community. Each of them are doing such important work, with Mia being the executive. Sorry, I'm just so nervous being with all of you. The executive director of Friends of Minidoka and a member of Tadaima's steering committee. Kurt being the education specialist at the National Park Service's Southern Idaho Parks, and Setsuko Winchester being a ceramic artist, photographer, journalist, and creator of the Yellow Bowl project. But yeah, thank you all of you for joining me today for this conversation.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thanks, Hiro.
Yeah, so for this conversation, we've kind of gathered here today to kind of talk about our experiences as Shin-Nikkei within the Japanese American community, and really what being Shin-Nikkei means to us. But before we get started, I wanted to talk a little bit about the definition of both Nikkei and Shin-Nikkei within the community. So when the term Nikkei has evolved throughout the decades that it was first brought into the community, and today I would say that a lot of people would define Nikkei as the having multiple and diverse meanings depending on the situation, places, and environment. Nikkei also include people of mixed racial descent and those who identify themselves. Sorry. Nikkei also includes people of mixed racial descent. But in 1988, when a council of Japanese Americans all across California and the West Coast gathered in LA, they had decided that the Nikkei community was individuals whose ethnic heritage include, but are not limited to, Japanese ancestry, are to be embraced as being Japanese American. Any individuals who wish to identify with the Japanese American community should be seen as being a member of the Nikkei community. Individuals who immigrated to the United States after World War II, and individuals with any Japanese ancestry from all parts of the country, all socioeconomic strata, both genders, and all sexual orientations are to be embraced as being Japanese American. So all those kind of encompass into the definition of Nikkei. But that being said, I feel like within more recent decades, the word Shin-Nikkei has become a more popular term within the community as more and more Shin-Nikkei become a part of the community. And the definition of Shin-Nikkei, in my opinion anyways, is somebody whose family or they themselves have come to America, but after World War II. So in that sense, they don't have a blood connection to anybody that was incarcerated in the camps. But that being said, with the definitions of both Nikkei and Shin-Nikkei, I wanted to hear what you guys feel is your definition of Nikkei and Shin-Nikkei.
Who wants to go first?
Thanks, Mia, for going first.
Oh, sure. My pleasure. I think of Nikkei as basically anyone of Japanese ancestry around the world, because I know there's really robust Japanese, both immigrant and multi-generational communities throughout the world, like especially in South America, Brazil, and just anywhere. So I think of Nikkei as like more broadly speaking of the Japanese diaspora, and then Shin-Nikkei I would usually just say, post-World War II immigrants to the States, if we're speaking about in the Japanese American context.
I could go next. I just thought that everybody was Nikkei if you were Japanese and you were in America. So I had never even heard of the term Shin-Nikkei until I was invited to this panel. So now I'm really glad that I have a term to describe myself, because I do think that Japanese who came to America before World War II and those after who came after were kind of separated, because some knew a certain story and others were completely, ignorant to it unless somebody shared it with them. So they didn't feel that they could be an authority other than to say, I heard it from somebody else, or until now, where there is so much scholarship that someone like me who grew up knowing nothing about it, I became fascinated about the whole story. And I think it's essential to understanding race in America and just what it means to be an American. I think it's an essential story.
And Setsuko, I love that. And I love your candidness when you say this term, this defined term, helps us create our identity. All four of us on this phone call are Shin-Nikkei, by the way we define ourselves. Shin-Nikkei to me is my mom who's watching this right now. So, お母さんにも絶対, like, ありがたい気持ちがあると思う, right? This idea that I'm very thankful for my mom in being able to bring and bridge a Japanese community and then to help me open up a Japanese American community. The term Nikkei, I think Mia did it perfectly. It's this notion of, it's a pretty big and nebulous thing. But Shin-Nikkei helped me find my direction in this community. And I could only thank Kota Mizutani of the JACL who introduced that term to me a decade ago. And now I have a word to work off of. So I'm super excited to unpack this term with you all for the next few.
Yeah,
I'm
definitely. Since Kurt and Setsuko already mentioned when they first heard of this term, Mia, do you remember when was the first time you had heard this term being used?
I don't. I can't think of any sort of definitive moment that I became aware of it. I'll let you know if I remember something.
Oh yeah, no problem. But yeah, I think for me, it was a couple of years ago as well. And it was at a book signing for a hotel on the corner of Bitter and Sweet. Yeah, let's see. So while growing up, what capacity did your family involve themselves within the community, if at all?
You go.
Go ahead, Setsuko.
Well, I grew up in a very, because they were Shin-Nikkei, most of them were my parents' generation were Japanese. So everybody spoke Japanese. And in some ways, I was the translator for my mom. So my dad would be working in New York City and, the telephone operator would say, what kind of phone do you want? Do you want a princess phone? Do you want a dial-up? And we were the ones who would translate for my mom. So I think I felt like Nikkei was just a Japanese person living in America. So I thought, and all our neighbors were like, what are you? You're Japanese. It wasn't something that I chose. It was something that was told to me. You're Japanese. That was it. Yeah. So I thought, okay, I'm Japanese.
I kind of identify with that, but a little bit different because I grew up in Idaho. So there was no like Shin-Nikkei community or Japanese American community that I was aware of. So I just grew up knowing, that I identified as having, my grandmother who was from Japan, my mother who was born in Japan, family that we visited and, communicated with in Japan, but I didn't know what it looked like in any sort of larger context of Shin-Nikkei or Japanese American community until much, much later, like in college, when I started to understand the difference of these sectors of the community. And that was all based on my first realization of the camp history, which I never learned about until going to college in Southern California.
And I think that's the segue I'm looking for, is Southern California. I'm very lucky to have grown up in the South Bay of Los Angeles. And I'm so sorry, Hiro, but the South Bay is most definitely in Southern California and not in Northern California, if you can even call it that. Yeah, that's right. I drew that line. Torrance, California, Gardena, California, Redondo Beach, Palos Verdes. This is the Nikkei community. It was thrust upon me. It was everywhere around me. For those of you who don't have context, I like to say that Torrance probably has more ramen shops outside of Japan than any other place in the United States, maybe even beating the island of Hawaii where I was born.
Okay.
But 12.7%.
I'm coming.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Absolutely. And 12.7% of the Torrance, California, is Japanese American identifying, and I think that that portion of the Japanese community really wasn't a choice. It was just kind of the way that my identity was built. With that said, and I think we'll get into this a little bit deeper, but Setsuko talked about a little bit of this notion of alienation within the community. And I'm not speaking for everybody's experience, but I can say because Torrance has a strong Japanese American traditionally named community, you have your Yonseis, your Goseis now, you have your mixed ethnicity groups as well, which is within the Shin-Nikkei community also. It was hard. It was hard to find where I could navigate, whether it was because I knew the second generation of Pokemon before folks knew even what that was, or if I watched anime that was in Japanese and not translated over. I think there's just so many different experiences from food I brought to school. So Shin-Nikkei, I think, encompasses a lot of experiences, but in terms of Japanese American community, I really didn't get to go into it until I went to a community center like the Gardena Japanese Cultural Institute. That was really my first jump in.
Yeah, and I would have to agree with you, Kurt. I was born and raised in Southern California, so I'm on your side. South Bay is definitely in SoCal, not NorCal. I mean, I may go to school in NorCal, but I'll be a Southern California guy all my life. But anyways, in terms of my own family being involved, when I was like very, very young, my bachan would like take me to to her salons and such, but her salons would just be speaking in Japanese. And from a very young age, I was somewhat like in contact with the more Japanese national side of the community. But as I grew up and my mom and my dad started taking care of me more and I wasn't babysat by my grandmother as much, I was kind of taken away from that. And when my mom was growing up, there was a lot of discrimination in America against Japanese still. And as a result, she decided that she would just throw her Japanese heritage to the side and just be what people would define as an American. So unfortunately, because my mom assimilated, when she started taking care of me more often, I too was assimilated and I wasn't really introduced into any of my Japanese culture. And because my mom didn't take part in the Japanese American community, I didn't take part in the community either. And it wasn't until I reached the age of 19 or so, or 20, that I really realized that there was a Japanese American community and that there was a community that welcomed me with open arms. So I think growing up, I just was also very disconnected. But yeah. So on that note, I realized that I became more involved in the community when I was 19 or 20 because of some programs that I got to be involved in. How did each of you become involved within the community?
So as I said, I started learning about the camp history in undergrad, and at first I didn't even identify with it. I just thought it was, shocking and bizarre that we never heard about it, but I didn't like delve into it as having really a personal connection until a couple of years later when I found out that there was family through marriage that actually was Japanese American and had a history of being incarcerated. And then I started to think about like my grandmother's friends that I grew up like going to visit in Central California. I started to realize that they were like Nisei, and that's when I started to understand what Japanese American historical community was, as opposed to what, my direct family connection was. But then I started unpacking it, and that's when I even realized there was a camp in Idaho, because we don't generally learn about it here as much. I know that Kurt and I are working on changing that with the Minidoka site, but that was really shocking to me to hear that there was a site in Idaho. And then I just kind of fell into a rabbit hole, and I did my undergrad thesis about the pilgrimage to Manzanar and how the Japanese American community of survivors felt about the National Park Service interpretation and preservation of the site. And then I moved back to Idaho to continue to study the relationship between the National Park Service and community organizations in preserving the Minidoka site, which also happened to be a National Park Service unit. And then from then, I was hired as the executive director of the Friends of Minidoka in 2016. So I've just kind of fallen into this rabbit hole from doing a paper in undergrad, but I'm happy to be here.
Thank you, Mia. Did Kurt or Setsuko want to add to anything?
Wait, I forgot what the question was.
So.
Oh, how did I
get involved?
How did I get involved? I think like I said, we had no Japanese people. There's not that many Japanese people on the East Coast, first of all, and most of them were immigrants back in the 60s after the war. And so the assumption is that if you look like this, you were Japanese, and they would always say, wow, your English is so good, and I would say, thank you. But I think that, so you were either Japanese or you were American, and American meant white. That's what American meant. So, I didn't know any Japanese Americans, and most Japanese Americans just said they're Japanese. So there was no distinction. But in California, everyone, a lot of Americans say to me, why do you have like generations? Like, why do you say nise, ise, sanse, yonse? And I didn't understand this until I found out that it's because of US law. Because the first generation of Japanese people were never allowed to naturalize. So it made a difference whether you were ise or if you're nise, because nise was the first generation that was born in the United States and could be an American. So then if you're like sanse, then they're like, oh, then I definitely have a right to be an American. So when I tell, Americans, they're like, so, why did they count? And I said, well, Japanese people don't count. Like, they don't say like, I'm like 2,500 say in like Japan. It's only American, and it's only because of American law. That's why, you really have to, each generation has a different experience in America because the laws changed, starting in like the 1890s to turn of the century to 1913, 1924 was like, no Asians, period. No Japanese, Chinese, no Asians, right? So then all of a sudden you had this huge gap. So and then it makes sense that there's a Shin-Nikkei, because Shin-Nikkei is the first time that there was an influx of Japanese immigration, essentially after 1924, right? So it's like a whole generation of people that sort of are, the same heritage, but have different life experiences or American experiences. Yeah.
And I just want to make sure I include the notion that, the counting system, if we had to call it that, you could also see that within our Japanese Canadian communities. If you could trace that also to our Japanese Brazilian communities as well, where the term Nikkei has taken its own identities across those communities. So Setsuko-san, I really do appreciate it. And obviously here I am saying Setsuko-san because that's what happens when you're within a Shin-Nikkei panel and you're appreciating that the word Nikkei is said Nikkei and pronounced in the way that it is. To answer your question, Hiro, I think in terms of how I was able to join the community, the first time I read Farewell to Manzanar was in 6th grade. It was a mandatory book for the Madrona Middle School in Torrance, California, as you can imagine, because of our Japanese American community that we had, but didn't really give it too much thought. And it was really through this community with the JACL here in Greater Los Angeles, where I got to meet wonderful mentors like Kanji Sahara, who hosts these karaoke things on Fridays, who really helped me build that community. But as Mia was talking about looking inside into your own family, it really wasn't until I realized that my own grandfather, through marriage, Ted Okushiba, he was in Poston and Crystal City growing up. So while I navigated the JACL for its civil rights missions, I still, whenever it came to a conversation about camp, all camp was that thing I read in Farewell to Manzanar. And all I was able to identify with was that. But suddenly, kind of learning my own family history and realizing as my grandfather finally talked about the story, I felt like I had this ticket. I was able to sit at the Japanese-American table for the first time. And that led me to an internship with the Minidoka National Historic Site. You fast forward that to experience working as education manager at the Oregon Nikkei Endowment, now the Japanese American Museum of Oregon, and then coming back here in Idaho. So folks don't know, both me and I are here in Idaho, working for the National Park Service again, doing education work on many subjects, including Minidoka's story. But I do want to just kind of point out one thing that I've experienced within the community itself, whether it's kind of, as I was saying earlier, feeling ostracized from the community as a child, where slurs like fresh off the boat and fob was thrown around a lot in exchange. A lot of the bullying I faced wasn't between myself and a white person. It was myself and the Nikkei community at large here who said that, you're different from the rest of us. It reminds me of that Fresh Off the Boat episode, Eddie Huang, the Fresh Off the Boat, I think it's ABC. But there's a moment where he is told by another kid at school that he's at the bottom of the totem pole, and being labeled fresh off the boat because I had an accent, because my mom spoke Japanese and that's what I spoke at home, because I went to Japanese after school programs and I didn't play basketball, but I played J-League soccer. I did sorobang instead of and my friends did kumon, things of that nature. There was a feeling of outsideness. The last time I really felt that in the community was at a pilgrimage. And at this pilgrimage, they have people who do photos of generations. And there was a moment, and I love the Nikkei community because we're so, I think, in tune with each other. But they were making a call out for Issei, Nisei, Sansei, Yonsei mixed generation photos. And then I was, bringing up to somebody, hey, what about me? Where do I fit in?
Right.
And it, it wasn't until somebody brought it up that now, the majority of pilgrimages that I know of will account for this community of folks who, as Setsuko-san is saying, we love this story. This is our identity too. So the community and my relationship with the community has been up and down, but it's thanks to groups like Friends of Minidoka or here at Minidoka National Historic Site that I feel like I really have a place here.
Can I just say something about feeling included or not included in the Japanese American community? It's just when there's so few Japanese people, like on the East Coast, unless you're Japanese. I think the moment I really realized I am Japanese American is when I would go to Japan, for summer vacation, and I would try to be Japanese. And in the playground, my sisters and I would be speaking to each other in English, and then we had a ring of kids, Japanese kids, saying "gaijin, gaijin, gaijin." So then I realized, wow, I'm really not Japanese. But then I came back to America, and then I had a bunch of my neighbors, and they're my Jewish neighbors, and actually she was one of my best friends. I mean, she became my best friend later, but I think even in the 60s, there was a lot of Jap this, Jap that, still going on. And so they wrote, Setsuko's a Jap go home, and things like that. So I realized, I guess I'm a Jap, in America. So I didn't feel like either community embraced me. And when I really looked into it and looked at what it means to be Japanese in America, of Japanese heritage and be an American citizen, this is the story. This is the story. Even if you're a citizen, you could lose all your rights and end up in a concentration camp. So that is a very, very American story. I I, went to all the 10 camps. I was invited to the FDR library to present my artwork for the 75th anniversary of Executive Order 9066. And a lot of, organizations, even like NPR, for which I had worked for 10 years, said I couldn't tell the story because I didn't have any family in the camps. So, I don't think that you should have to have family who actually experienced news stories or history that you're investigating, but for some reason that's important with this story, and I've been excluded because of that. But I've done a tremendous amount of research, and it's fascinating story, and it's definitely American. It's not, as most people said to me, take it to the Japan Society, I was told. They said, take it to the Asia Society. And I said, you know what? The story isn't about Asians or Japanese. It's about Americans and what happened in America. And it was done to them by the American government. So it's very much an American story. It's American history. Yeah. And
I think I've had, I've been on panels in the past at pilgrimages and talked about like mixed race identity more. And that's part of it is like, I was kind of alluding to my Shin-Nikkei identity more, but saying like, do I have, can I stake a claim on this history because I'm doing it. And I think that's my argument, right? Is that it is part of American history. It's part of growing up in Idaho, and it's part of being Japanese American, whether or not you have the family history, because it's such a touchstone with the Japanese American community that I think that Shin-Nikkei have a responsibility to have a basic understanding of it. But I was a little bit not nervous, but kind of excited for this conversation because I've never really been in a space talking about specifically like my Shin-Nikkei identity. And I think it's, I've had my whole life to sort of grapple with my mixed race identity, growing up in a mixed family. I know my cousin Emily's in the comment section. But I'm, Japanese and Mexican on my mom's side. My dad is white. We have a super mixed family. And, that's such a strong part of how I identify. But in terms of the Shin-Nikkei identity, I think it really is complicated for me within the community space, aside from the community space. Like, even if I've been in Shin-Nikkei, like, community, like in, like, my college experience, I always still feel sort of like there's always this tension of me fitting into all these multiple spaces. And I feel like, Hiro, I'd be interested to hear your experience too, being mixed race and Shin-Nikkei. There's just so many, like, I don't know, I'm always like in the middle of something, like I'm always never fully one thing. I'm always like in this negative space. And I'm comfortable with that. That's just who I am. But it's also weird, like, I feel like no matter what space I'm navigating, I always have to feel like I don't know, like I have to assert myself that I am all of these things, even though I don't have the full experience of what you would think of as maybe a typical Shin-Nikkei. Like, I didn't grow up with in a Japanese speaking household, and I didn't grow up going every summer to stay with relatives or whatever that typical experience may be. And I think that is, I think that everyone's experience is going to be more nuanced than whatever we think the typical is. Like, I just found out recently that my grandmother was involved in the JCL in her community, like in the 70s, which I'd never heard about until I became involved with my JCL. So it just raises a lot of questions of things to continue to unpack, and everything is just so nuanced. And I don't know.
Add one thing, Mia, if you had 1/16 Japanese blood, 1942, you had to go to the camps. So 1/16 Japanese blood, you had to go. So you're Japanese according to the American U.S. government. So yeah, you're definitely.
Yeah. And so I appreciate bringing that up. And Hiro, I don't mean to take your fire, because I am also personally interested to hear your tackling of this identity as well. But I think Mia brought up a good point. I want to bring up Setsuko's point. But y'all, when we're talking about the Nisei experience, we are living the Nisei experience. When I look at the honor roll at Minidoka and I see K. Ikeda as a person who's on the honor roll, I can recognize that that person probably grew up in a bilingual household, probably had the same pitches and pulls 70 plus years ago. If it's not the new Niseis who aren't tackling this history, if it's not the new Niseis who could probably, and this is a big probable depending on the community, you're in a new Iseis who could speak Japanese, to speak to the Hibachans of the Yonseis. If we don't capitalize on getting this community involved into the story sooner than later, we're missing out, because the analogy of Minoru Yasui is me, right? Is Hiro, right? The analogy of Mitsue Endo is Mia, right? And I really want the folks who are watching this call or in this webinar with us, if you yourself are... Yes.
Identify with Korematsu.
Yes, and if you are Shin-Nikkei in this current webinar with us, and I want to make sure I say it again, you are part of the community, whether you know it or not. And when you read about these people in history, I want you to identify with the fact that that person might understand you just a little bit better than their great-grandchildren. I think that's really cool. And Hiro, I do want to hear from you as well. What does this mean for you?
I think, well, overall, like how we were just talking about, like how we feel connected to the community in a sense. One thing that I have always, in a sense, justified my involvement in the community is that, like Setsuko was talking about, in the 60s, there's a lot of discrimination against all Japanese, whether they were Shin-Nikkei or if they were Nikkei and had been here for generations. And the consequences or the struggles that the Japanese Americans have faced after the camps are similar, or the exact same are the exact same struggles that Japanese immigrants were feeling when they came to America in the 50s and 60s. Because the white American at the time didn't care if you just immigrated or if you were in camp. You were still a quote unquote Jap to them. And it's because of this discrimination that my mom experienced that I too feel a lot of the consequences that many current day Yonsei and Gosei and Orokusei experience today. Like I myself, I don't know how to speak Japanese, and I don't know a lot of Japanese cultural events or holidays, all because my grandmother and my mom thought that it would be a safer bet for me to be a white American rather than experience my Japanese culture, because they didn't want me to go through what my grandmother and my mom went through when they came to America in the 60s. So that being said, I feel that connection with the Japanese American community because my culture was stolen as well. Even though my family didn't experience the incarceration, we experienced the effects afterwards. And being of like mixed race on top of that just adds to the whole thing of growing up, this whole question of, am I enough? Am I and I feel like at this point in my life, where for the last 4 years or so, I've dedicated everything I do towards the Japanese American community. I've interned for the Go for Broke National Education Center. I've interning for, I'm wearing their shirt right now. I've interned for the National Japanese American Historical Society, and right now I'm working with Japanese American Memorial Pilgrimages and Tadaima, and in each of those things, I've come to this space where I feel comfortable as a Japanese American, and I do tell myself that I am enough. Unfortunately, I'm still working on that with my Mexican American heritage, but it's a journey and it's a process that every individual of mixed descent has to goes through, and I'm sure Mia could agree with me on that. This constant identity crisis,
Yeah, that just brings in even more confusion. But I think, one of the things I was thinking about going into this panel was that there's always, I think everyone has imposter syndrome in whatever like setting, like whether it's work or something. But I think part of that has always been like imposter syndrome within my super mixed identity, because, you know, as Shin-Nikkei in a Japanese American space, or as a quarter Japanese person in a Japanese American space, or as a quarter Mexican person in a Mexican American space, or even within like the Shin-Nikkei narrative of having like, you know, my grandmother would more be like the traditional Issei, but she was a war bride, but my mom was born on base, but she's mixed. So it's just, that's what I was, and then she's kind of like a Kibe too, because my mom actually went back to elementary school in Japan, but I don't know. So there's all these different layers, and I'm sure we all have them. And then also the complication that comes from like when I'm reclaiming this history and this community and this work, I'm always aware that I can't really verbalize it and have these kinds of conversations with like my family in Japan because of the language barrier. You know, I can chit chat with them, but I can't talk about World War II history and my emotional identity. And so I don't know, there's just so many things to navigate.
And Mia, I appreciate you saying that. And I think, you know, to sum it up, right, it's not Japanese enough for Japan, maybe not Japanese American enough for the Nikkei community. It's, and I wrote this in a poem, but, you know, we really are that hyphen line, right? That a lot of folks draw within the community itself. And then I appreciate both you and Hiro for being very honest and being very forthcoming and open with this group, because I hope for the folks who are listening along, this is a healing process for you all too, who might share any of our identities, whether you're a Nikkei person on the East Coast, or you were lucky to be like Hiro and myself growing up where a lot of folks look like you.
So before we start dipping into some of the questions on the chat, I guess in the last quote-unquote discussion question would be, how do y'all feel that we can get more Shin-Nikkei involved within the community if they're too afraid to, like for the longest time, I was afraid to become involved?
Can I go? I think that we need to learn about it in school. You know, I didn't learn about it in school. I learned about it because I had a substitute teacher when it was like 1971 or something. Whenever Farewell to Manzanar came out, and the substitute teacher brought it in, you know, wasn't part of the curriculum, wasn't part of anything. And everybody in the class said, you know, that's not true. It doesn't happen in America. Yeah, that doesn't happen. Yeah. and then they said, then the substitute teacher said, yes, it is true. You know, they wrote this whole book about it. And then they said, well, if anybody would know, she would. And they pointed at me. But as a Shin-Nikkei, we didn't experience that, and the Nikkei community wasn't talking about it at that time. There was a lot of discrimination, and you know, nobody was saying anything because, yeah, they don't want to look like they're a prisoner. They hadn't committed a crime, but they were put into concentration camps. So, and they were, you know, they were seen as the enemy by their own countrymen. So it was, you know, nobody talked about it. So that it created this odd divide. And I only learned since starting this project that there was this whole Japanese American community who had been in the camps. A lot of them were Christian now. So I've only recently discovered them.
I just like to underline that it sounds like 3 of us were first introduced to the camps through Farewell to Manzanar.
See, so learning in school that it's taught as part of America and the American experience, and the rule of law, and what the law says about who can be an American and who can't. That says it all. Mm-hmm. And it's important. It's important that we know that.
And Setsuko, I really appreciate your points out there. And Mia, what a great coincidence, right? How Farewell to Manzanar opened the doors up for us in times when we need it the most. Hiro, I'm going to take your question. I'm going to flip it on its head for a second, and I'm going to try to address it. I think when we think about the Nikkei community, think about how do we get Shin-Nikkei involved. I think the other question is how do we get Nikkei involved in the Japanese community at large, right? When's the last time someone came to a Kenjinkai meeting, right? When's the last time that folks have told their younger nephew to go to a Kakehashi program and go to Japan? I think we also need to recognize that, and someone wrote it in the comments, but there is continuous immigration from Japan moving forward and forward and forward. We have to recognize as Nikkei people that we're also a part of an international community. And I think that is important for us to reckon with. But to get to the point about how do we get more Shin folks to be identifying or continuing to do this work, if you do a quick Google search for Shin-Nikkei right now, right, chances are the first person you'll get is a Pacific Citizen article by Rob Busher, who's my future brother-in-law, and Rob wrote this thing about Nikkei identity. And it's in there that you see it defined. The term is rarely used outside of scholarly spaces, and it's just over the past maybe decade and a half really trying to grab consciousness. So in terms of getting the Shin-Nikkei community involved, I think it's really about how do we make sure that the Nikkei community is creating these spaces and affinity groups to be able to break this down. I would be amiss to say that we're within the week and a few days in the commemoration and remembrance of folks who were in the destruction of Japan in Hiroshima and Nagasaki during World War II, right? For folks who might identify with our identity here, that means something to us. And recognizing that, once again, the Nikkei community is indeed international, and that we all share certain words throughout our community, whether it's onigiri or omusubi, whether it's otoire or benjo, right? I mean, we need to recognize and reckon with these pieces. But I think I would really ask the Nikkei community, what are you all doing to open the door for us to really erase that hyphen line and bring us to the same stage that you all are at? But I would love to hear what Mia's work is in this, because she's been in the community work longer than I have.
Well, I just wanted to highlight, I think there's a lot of opportunity there, and I'm not sure what the overlap is in places that have really robust Japanese American communities and really robust Shin-Nikkei communities, like maybe in Los Angeles. I'd be curious to see what the overlap is in places like LA, Hawaii, maybe, I don't know, Chicago, places where they have large communities. But I think it's really special that in Boise, as much as I despair not having a large community, like having a Japantown and lots of good home-style Japanese restaurants, there is already a relationship between our JACL and IJA, which is the Idaho Japanese Association, which is a community group for Shin-Nikkei here, families that are moving here through business or whatever. So I think there's opportunity in small communities where people think that maybe their JCL is dwindling or there's not a huge community. I would push people to make those connections and to support each other's events. And I think we all have more in common than we think. So I think that is something cool happening here in Boise, at least.
Thank you, Mia. And with that being said, I think it's time to move on to some questions from the comments. Our first question is from Junko Gora, and they said, I'm Shin-Nikkei and bilingual. Are there more Shin-Nikkei that are bilingual, or is it a case by case? Because not all parents can battle their kids going to school 6 days a week.
If I could jump on this one, and I would say, Junko-san, I understand how you're feeling. There's another Junko on this call who could point and say, yes, my son fought tooth and nail not to go to J school on Saturday mornings because I did not want to go to Japanese language school. I wanted to watch my Saturday morning cartoons to become more American. That's a deep-seated thing right there. Are there more Shin-Nikkei that are bilingual? I think that's an interesting conversation. I think for a lot of folks here who might have grown up in a community like me and Hiro's, we could talk about how language has possibly defined the way we look at the world as well. A lot of my friends were Shin Isseis, right, who were born in Japan and came over, and whose usually was father's business would bring them back to Japan 5, 6, 7, 10 years later. These would be folks who grew up in the American school system, but then would work to be able to go to college in Japan, for example. And that was the majority of my friends growing up as well. I think in terms of being bilingual, and I would challenge the person who asked this question to really think about how we are continuing to introduce not just Japanese culture as we remember it, but also Japanese culture as it evolves. There was until recently a Netflix TV show, right, that Mia and I used to watch that would help us kind of connect a little bit with the Japanese community in the 2000s, obviously. But I think it really is about continuing to keep the general community in mind of what's happening in Japan, whether it's relief efforts after various natural disasters. But it is hard. My mom put me in soroban classes, and I have shodan, right, and a black belt in abacus, which is completely useless at times. But that's where my Japanese language came from. But I would love to hear Setsuko or Mia, in your opinion about language. How does that define, or how do we build that?
Well, I grew up, we have all sorts of slang incorporated in our family, and it wasn't until I was like 20 that I could realize if something was Japanese versus Spanish, because I would just assume it was one or the other, and then I find out later that it's totally not the case. And like we would speak basic Japanese, like if you're at the store and you want to say something that you don't want other people to hear or whatever. So it was like really, really basic. I went to Japanese school in kindergarten here, and then there was just such a small demand for it that it wasn't any longer available for us. And I always hated that. And so I did study Japanese for like 6 years in undergrad and college, and then studied abroad. So my Japanese language has developed further in life, but I didn't grow up like with, Kurt's level of fluency, and I'm always jealous of those that have it. I wish I did.
Well, I grew up speaking Japanese because we were just with my mom all the time. So when I went to kindergarten, I knew like Apuru or hello. So I was terrified in kindergarten. I was like, I can't speak English, and I cried all day the first day. But then I can't even remember not being able to speak English after that. I just learned really quickly. But every Saturday we had to go to Japanese school. But in 6th grade, I actually quit because I was doing gymnastics, and a friend of mine took me to a cheerleading tryout. And it turns out that all the the football games were on Saturday mornings when the Japanese school was happening. So my mom said, which would you rather do? And I said, well, I'm in America, so I think I'd like to do what American kids do. So I ended up being a cheerleader. I don't know. I always felt confident in my Japaneseness, or that nobody, I couldn't even lose my Japaneseness when I wanted to, I was like, hey, I'm American just like you, but I was always Japanese. So I never had any concern about that. I guess I recently read a memoir by Frank Inoue, who was in Heart Mountain, and he was one of the first resistors who ended up cooperating with the administration. But everything that he says 75 years ago, I've been asking the same questions. So I think the Nikkei go through this experience, generation after generation after generation. And because American society doesn't teach you this history, each generation has to learn it on their own, unless there's a community to teach it to them, So I think, I don't know. I think it's important. I wish I'd known this sooner, and I think that it connects to any immigrant, and especially people of color. People of color can learn from this experience. So don't feel like it only needs to be, Nikkei, or it's sort of a universal American experience, and a story that's should resonate with anybody who, if the law tells you you're American or not. And if you're not, then how are you treated differently? It's happening to, people from Latin America right now. Some of them have been here for 40 years. Why can't they be an American? What? Yeah. So anyway, Hiro, your story.
Like I said, when I was young, there was a lot of, similar to me, we would just use different words to like use the slang. I remember remember in kindergarten, there were a couple times where I didn't know the English word to something. And I was just so frustrated because I was trying to tell my friends or the teacher something, and it just wouldn't get across. I also remember it wasn't until high school that I realized zori was a Japanese word. I don't know why it took so long for me to realize that, but it was just my friends and I were going to go to the beach, and my family had always called sandals zori. And I was just like, oh, I need to go get some new zori at Target. My old zori broke, and they're like, Hiro, what are you talking about? And I was like, zori. And then like it hit me that like the way I pronounced it was like how I pronounce every other Japanese word I know. And I was just like, oh, right. So I really would say to Junko that the Japanese language and Shin-Nikkei, being learned by Shin-Nikkei is a very case-by-case like thing. Like Mia and I, like it sounds as though Mia and I are not fluent in it, but Kurt and Setsuko, are you fluent or fluent enough?
I can't. I'm not reading and writing, but I can.
Yeah. So you have two people in this discussion who can, and two that who can, and like so that just shows that I think it's case by case.
Yeah, and I think to take Setsuko-san's point, right, yomikaki dekinai, right? That's probably a phrase that we say a lot. Shabereru kedo yomikaki dekinai. I can't read or write. I can't read or write. And sadly, my mother's probably crying. She heard that on the YouTube video. Right? That's a great question.
So I think we have time for one more question. I apologize. I didn't realize how much we could we really dive into these things, because I feel like this is one of the first times where we've been in a space, like Mia said, where we've been with other Shin-Nikkei and we're able to really just speak how we feel and how we experience the community. So for this last question, let's do the one from Thomas M. Kurihara. Are there similar Shin-Nikkei have support organizations different from the older organizations, since there are few, if any, Shin-Nikkei joining JCL and other older organizations? So I believe the question is asking if there's any organizations that give support to Shin-Nikkei, and if there isn't, have you found that a lot of Shin-Nikkei are joining other organizations such as the JCL? Or that, at least that's how I'm interpreting it.
I don't know about the West Coast, but by doing this project, I found out that there's the JAA, which is the Japanese American Association, and then there's JAJA. There's so many different groups, like the Japanese Christian group, and then there's JACL. There's so I feel like all these different groups are so fractured. Sometimes I wish we could all be together. But I do like this Shin-Nikkei idea, where there is a kind of commonality and an experience of not being Japanese or American, and trying to reconcile that today. I don't know. I wish somebody would create one in New York.
I think there's more Shin-Nikkei organizations out there than we're aware of. Mm-hmm. I know, we've got a small one in Idaho, and I'm sure there's more out there. I don't know, Kurt, if you guys had more experience with Kenjinkais.
Yeah, so my mom is in the Kenjinkai leadership here in the Yamagata Kenjinkai, which is awesome. And I think, for Thomas who asked the question, I'm looking at the South Bay Japanese American Needs Assessment, which is brought by the Tokyo Service Committee. And I think they have an interesting kind of survey where they ask English speakers, Japanese speakers, and both speakers kind of where they go, right, as a Nikkei community together. And a big one kind of goes into, we go to Japanese supermarkets, right? If you're familiar with Mitsuwa or Yaohang before it became Mitsuwa, right? Or Marugai or Don Quixote, depending on who you're asking. So you have the supermarket community, then you have your language school community, then your sports league community, you have your service centers like JCI, various kind of spaces like that. Faith-based organizations, there's a huge portion of faith-based spaces. Me and I also being a part of one ourselves that incorporate kind of the Shin community. But I think it's really nebulous because Shin-Nikkei is kind of in this middle ground between folks who identify as Japanese or Japanese national or Japanese identifying. Then you have Nikkei, who are these kind of more so Japanese American in their experiences. So when we think of Shin-Nikkei specific identifying spaces, as similar to me, I think we could find that, but I can't really think of a specific org that we might be able to pull for that.
Well, I just think of it as like a redux of the Issei coming over in like 1900. I think they created community, and it,
Right.
of course, new immigrant communities are also creating communities, whether it be through religious organizations, social services, cultural community centers. So I think, they definitely exist. We're just not as familiar with them if we're not directly part of that community.
Yeah, and this reminds me, Kopani, which just happened, I think, last year, recently.
Yeah.
For those of you who don't know Kopani, and maybe somebody else who's a little more well-versed could give me the actual translation or the acronym, but this is kind of opening up this Nikkei space on an international basis where other folks who identify as Shin-Nikkei, post-World War II Nikkei, could kind of discuss those differences. Luckily, Mia and I were able to go to Canada, right, where we were, oh my gosh, I'm forgetting the event name, I'm so sorry.
Kikiai, or Ensoku.
Kikiai with Ensoku, which was field trip, right? Ensoku, that group kind of opened up a space for us too. I'm loving how the Nikkei community is finding words like Tadaima and Ensoku and Kikiai to really define our experiences. I think language finds a way of creeping back in. And as a linguist, that's really what's interesting to me. Thanks, Kimiko. The Convention on Pan-American Nikkei. So for the person who asked the question, I would look into Kopani if you're interested.
So we did get the okay to go a little bit longer. So if it's all right with y'all, we can answer a few more questions from the audience.
Okay.
Let's do it.
Cool. Okay. So the next question we'll go through is from Simon Winchester. Do you think the community might be doing itself few favors, all the slicing and dicing of its community, not only the JANM and JCL divide, but this whole Shin-Nikkei thing? Do Koreans and Chinese do the same?
Good question.
I think the pause is showing that we have a hard time answering this question.
Yeah, I mean, I didn't even know about a lot of these organizations. So it's hard. I never heard of the Kopani. Yeah, it would be nice to have a list of all of them. Maybe we could all like communicate with each other.
Yeah, no kidding.
Yeah.
Maybe before the question kind of leaves my mind, I think, Simon, what I would say to you is, and I would take what Setsuko-san has stated earlier, this notion that this counting of generations was really thrust upon our community, right? Going back to the 1800s and into early immigration. Now that we're celebrating Gannemono, right? This notion of really early Japanese pioneers. So it's not so much a slicing and dicing a community as more so I would probably say it was a necessity of our community to be able to cope, identify with, and process the incarceration. You take that idea, then while the term Shin-Nikkei or Sansei or Yonsei or Gosei or Hapa or mixed, all these words might feel divisive. But I must say, for myself, being able to identify with various portions of Japanese American and breaking it down into smaller affinities or identities really helps me recognize that I'm more than just what someone might see of me, which would be my almond-shaped eyes, right, and my paler yellow-esque skin, right. These slicing and dicing terms really, I think, actually provide a complexity to our community. I really wish that there was somebody of the Chinese American or Korean American community who could speak on this for us, because I think it's a good question. And I don't think, once again, it's a value statement of, is this one or the better? But I can say for myself, as Setsuko-san stated earlier, Shin-Nikkei has given me a pocket that I can really play in and work in and advocate from.
No, I agree. I think that it just shows the complexity of the Japanese American community, or even the Japanese community, because I think the way we're talked about in the media is that we're all one thing, all the Chinese, all the Koreans, and it's not true. We all have different experiences, and yet the language or the culture or the way the nation treated all of us, no matter where we came from. Brazil, right? Or Canada, we were all treated the same way. So there's a similarity, and yet there's complexity and differences in our experiences. So I think having these words, like now I know, are you Shin-Nikkei? It tells me exactly what, like where you fit in the diaspora. And I love that. I think that's great.
And I would add, like, it's really useful in community spaces because it's a safe space for the most part. I know that there's a lot of obsession with blood quantums, and it's been really problematic in the past within the Japanese American community. But like, I would react totally different if there was like a Nikkei person asking me like, oh, what's your generation? What's your mix? What's your story? Versus if somebody off the street was like, what are you? You know, that's going to be a completely different sort of reaction that you're going to get from me. So I think within community spaces, it is useful because it helps us have these types of, it's an opening to these types of conversations. And I don't know, it's just interesting to see like, oh, in what ways do I identify with the Nisei on the pilgrimage when everyone expects that I'm a Yonsei? And in what ways do I maybe identify with the Sansei because it was my grandmother that was the more Japanese speaking person? So I think they can be divisive, but I think within the, community spaces, it's how we identify, right?
Yeah, it's how we navigate. It's almost our roadmap.
Navigate.
Being lucky.
Word. Yeah.
Yeah, navigate, and I mean, even myself,
like,
engaged.
Yonsei.
Yeah. So like even myself, like engaged to somebody, right, who is of the Japanese American community, who grew up in the East Coast. This provides us some context, even in our own life personally, to navigate this. I do want to say one thing before we move off this question. It asks the point of, do Chinese and Korean Americans do the same? Also recognizing the fact that we have Chinese American, Japanese American mixed kids and people on this call, Korean and Japanese American mixed folks who are on this call, or in the community, and recognizing the fact that if we're talking about Shin identity, and we're talking about World War II on what might be my grandmother's side or some folks' grandfather's sides, that complicates our narrative even more, considering the war atrocities that also happened.
Right.
It's such a wonderfully complicated community that we're a part of.
Yeah.
So all this to say, I think it's a fantastic question, and I hope we tackled it well.
Yeah. I just wanted to add real quick, and I'm going to sound like a broken record, but just adding on to everybody how I feel like it's really helpful in terms of like when I'm talking to somebody and I know exactly what I can talk about with them and they would understand. Like, I feel like Kurt and I have seen each other in the community or heard of each other in the community a lot before Tadaima. And then when I found out that Kurt was a Shin-Nikkei, I was like, oh, he's like me. I can get along with him. That's going to be great. I'm so excited to meet him. So just things like that. And I don't see it as a way of dividing. I just see it as more, I can easily know what topics I can talk about with this person and which experiences of mine can compare with theirs. But yeah.
I also want to point out in the chat box, now I'm following the chat box, and thank you, Hanako, for the Japanese Korean in the house. I read that. And thank you, Sean Mira, who's a personal mentor and hero of mine. Right? Our communities have a diverse experience. We are not a flat monolith. And I think Sean puts it in the most poetic way possible. So I do appreciate that response. I just want to highlight what he said.
Exactly.
Let's see. Shall we go into another question? Okay. From Shayla Newland. What do you think about otherness and the Hapa who try to define themselves as fractions, half of this, a quarter of that, etc.? The kids in the movie One Big Hapa Family kept saying they were part Japanese, but didn't say what the other part is. This moves a little bit away from the Shin-Nikkei experience, I would say, but
Right.
I feel like some of us can definitely speak on it.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I just said, it can be problematic to speak in terms of blood quantums, but the reality is that it's kind of the easiest way to say it too. So I usually would try to say like, oh, I identify as multicultural or mixed race. Everyone's, well, I don't know, you guys maybe not, but mixed people are familiar with the whole struggle on the census box or the survey. And if there's no option, then you find the other. And if there's no option, then you have to go with whichever one you're feeling that day, or whichever one you think needs representation for that specific survey. And it's just really complicated. But I try to avoid the fractions if I can. And I just say I have a multicultural identity because I truly do identify with all my parts.
Go for it.
Oh, I completely understand, like, doing the mark-offs on all those, like, census and all, well, the census is better, but all those other forms where it asks you what your ethnicity and stuff is, especially being Japanese and Hispanic, like, when it says, like, Asian, but not Hispanic.
Oh, the non-Hispanic white, I don't know. I never know what they want, yeah.
I was just like, I'm both, I don't know what to tell you.
Yeah.
And so I think I myself have been working on moving towards identifying as mixed race. I feel like growing up, both my father and my mother wanted me to be as American as possible, so neither taught me any Japanese heritage or Mexican heritage or cultural practices. So it really wasn't until I was older that I was just like, that I first got involved in the Japanese American community, and I was just like, oh, I'm a Japanese American. And now that I've been involved in the JA community, I'm reaching that point where I'm also trying to get involved in the Mexican American community. And in that sense, I've been identifying more as a Mexican American as well, whereas before I only focused on my Japanese heritage. And that may just be because I was so close to my Japanese grandmother as well. But yeah, nowadays I'm definitely trying to identify as mixed race rather than just like saying I'm part this and part that. And then Kurt, you had something before I interrupted you?
No, that's me. And I need to recognize that in terms of mixed race communities. Go for it.
Sorry, I just wanted to add that I have an African American friend who's married to a Japanese woman and was very interested in Japanese culture and has a documentary that's called Double. So it's not half. They're double. So, I don't know if that's, I guess it doesn't help if you have multiple, more than double, but that's
that's perfect. That's what's on. Like that's what I was also trying to make the point as well as notion of hafu or dabu or fractions in that piece. But once again, I think me and Hiro, I think y'all said it best from your own personal experiences. So I can't add any more than that.
Let's see. Sorry, I didn't have the next one prepared. From Ken Mochizuki, there are assumptions and antagonisms between JAs and those from Japan. JAs talk about being treated as fake Japanese when they go to Japan. How do we bridge the divide?
I haven't heard of like people feeling like they were being called fake Japanese when they visited Japan, but I've heard a lot of people that are like, Sansei or Japanese Americans say that they go to Japan and they realize, oh no, I really am more American. But what I think that makes me think of is I learned in a race class in college because I was asked to write an essay on my racial identity, and I turned it in late because I didn't even know I had a lot of thinking to do. But I read an article about Japanese Brazilians and how they felt so Japanese when they were in Brazil, and then they went to Japan and they realized how Brazilian they were. And so there's this like experience of sort of rejecting or being rejected by the majority culture. And that kind of helped me understand how I unpacked my racial identity. And so, but I think as Shin-Nikkei, it's a little bit different. Like, I feel like there's a lot of things where if I'm in Japan, I really identify with, like, I feel really like home, even though there's all these things I can't completely relate to. I don't know. I've just gone astray.
Well, I mean, you're describing exactly what I experience, like when I go back to Japan, you're not Japanese, you know. So, I think it's more that sometimes when I'm thinking in English, so I end up saying phrases that aren't really Japanese phrases. They're actually English phrases that I said in Japanese. Um, like itadakimasu is like there's no, I don't know, bon appetit. I don't, but like there's certain phrases that are just very Japanese, and there instead of using that very Japanese phrase, I'll say an English phrase and just say it in Japanese. So that shows my foreignness, even though I speak the language. So sometimes it's not just about the language; it's about knowing customs and I guess that's why when I'm in America, for example, I had an incident on NPR where I used to do back when they had tapes instead of digital. Tapes and transcripts are available. Write a letter to 635 Massachusetts Avenue, and I had to do this tapes and transcript thing, and it kept breaking. Somebody kept breaking it or something like that. So I was told to go retape it, and the regular engineer wasn't there. So there was this other man there, and he said, what do you need to do? And I said, oh, I'll come back later. I'm supposed to do this tape. And he said, no, we could do it now. So we did the tape. He made a cart. He put it over on the side. And then later on, I went to edit another piece, and the regular engineer was there, and he said, hey, don't you have to do a tapes and transcripts cart? And I said, oh, I did that already. He said, no, I don't think so. And I said, yeah, I did. It's that card over there. And he said, no, I listened to it. That's not you. So I said, I think it is, because that's the card that he's, that's it. He said, I just put a piece of tape on it. I won't label it, but I'll just put a piece of tape on it. And I said, so he said, oh, all right, you want to listen to it? It's not you. So he puts it in, and both of us say, see? He said, see? And then I'm like, see, that's me. And he said, see, there's no accent. So when he sees my face, he always heard an accent. When he heard the voice separated from the face, he heard no accent. So it means that no matter how American I sounded, how American I acted, as long as I had this face, he just heard an accent.
Setsuko, I want to appreciate you for telling that story, because I bet everybody on this call and in the comment section can feel that moment. This forever foreigner, right? And I think we should let that term kind of settle in, right? This forever foreigner, and you put that alongside model minority myth, right? If you want to make that higher level Asian American 102, but that feeling that you felt in that moment, I want to honor that and make some space, and hope that whoever's listening in can realize that that experience isn't rare, and it sucks that it's not rare.
Yeah, it's not rare. Yeah.
Right. And getting to Ken's question, I think Ken's question has a similar feel, right? The term being used is assumptions and antagonisms. And I want to recognize that question itself holds a lot of weight, right? When Jays are told being fake Japanese, right? So being a Nikkei person seen as a forever foreigner in a majority white country, and then sharing possibly not even a face, but possible features or cultural pieces when you go to Japan, not being able to see in that way. Your passport, right, doesn't do enough. Or the dual passport and dual citizenship you might have doesn't do enough. How do we bridge this divide? I think that's a great question. Now putting on my JCL hat, right, when we're thinking about projects like Kakehashi program that provides this kind of cultural sharing spaces. There's a lot of also for older folks in their 20s and 30s and 40s, there's different Japanese consulate programs as well that really do try to bridge this. But I just want to recognize that, Ken, while we may not answer your question fully, I recognize and I hear you that the term being seen as fake something, fake anything, that hurts. And I hope that we can unpack that as a group moving forward as well.
Thank you, Kurt. So I think we'll transition into our last question for tonight. And I feel like this question will be a good segue to finishing up. And that's going to be from Junko Goda. The future of Nikkei. In 50 years, I could see Nikkei being stewards of telling stories of unjust incarceration in Hibakusha. We will continue to become diverse. What's our future look like to you? And I would like to add to that, what's our future of the Shin-Nikkei community look like to you?
I would like to see us be leaders in justice for all people. We're all human beings. There's so much that we share in common. I think we are the perfect people. I mean, we're the only people who've been bombed by an atom bomb, and every single president says that we had to do that. I mean, to me, that's really scary that people still think that today. And I think that story is important. So we shouldn't forget it.
I mean, I totally agree with that, and I would just love to continue to see more dialogue between, even like, it was really cool to have NHK as a partner on this, and to start to have more interest in the Japanese American experience in Japan, and hopefully more interest in the Shin-Nikkei experience within the Japanese American community. So I would love to just see an increased dialogue and more conversations like these, and even more diverse conversations, and hopefully even, with Nikkei diaspora worldwide. So I don't know in 50 years, but hopefully just a lot more of working together and having more of a broader Nikkei identity, and the responsibilities that come with that your question included.
Mia, I love the word responsibility in that. And Junko Goda, I just want to say thank you so much for throwing out all these questions. I feel like I'm in a Nisei Week panel right now, and I'm like I'm vying to become Nisei Week queen. So I'm gonna put on my best Shin Nisei Julie Yoshinaga hat and try to answer this in the best way I can. I imagine our future, that's a great question. I imagine our future as a community as we continue to expand what Nikkei means. Honestly, I don't have the answer for you for that. By that point, I'll be almost hitting 80, and I'll be able to look back, however, in those 50 years as a community elder like Kanji.
We'll be the
and we'll be, actually, Mia, that's perfect. We will be the Nisei at that point. And for those of you who are in the community, you know why the Nisei is a significant statement. And I'm just excited to become that person alongside my friends who are on this panel with me, as well as my family and my extended family and my new family as I join over the next few weeks.
Thank you, Kurt. And I think I'd like to thank all of you for joining me today for this conversation on Shin-Nikkei. I think everybody could tell everybody in the audience can tell just how much this community means to us, and just also the hoops we sometimes jump through in order to feel like we are accepted. Would anyone like to add anything else to this before we close out?
I'm just really glad to find you guys. I'm so happy, and that I have a name for us. Shin-Nikkei.
Okaeri nasai, right? That's what we would say, right? Tadaima, okaeri nasai. Yeah. For me, the last thing I would leave folks with, this is from Nihon Machi Roots, so San Francisco JCL. For those of you who know Tony Osumi and Jenny Kuida's 101 Ways to Know Your JA, it's a fantastic list. For those of you who are still exploring your Shin-Nikkei identity, definitely check out your Shin Nisei Issei Wen. It will make you feel seen. I'm going to read off just a few as I let Mia finish with the last word here, but I'm still read off a few for you all just to get some good feels going up. New Year's is the holiday. What is Christmas? You own a lot of manga. You make triangle onigiri. You have a Japanese name that you might use. Hiro, I'm looking at you. You know that Kewpie mayonnaise is the choice. You use colored pencils more than crayons. There's so much more. It gets a little bit deeper in here. The thought of hugging your parents makes you feel awkward or maybe make you smirk. You have dual citizenship. You may have rarely seen your dad growing up. You're embarrassed by your non-English speaking parents. You think about the war on both sides. And I want to honor that this conversation has been fun and has been hard. And I want to thank all the panelists here as we continue to navigate and make space for all Nikkei folks.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Hiro, for making space for us. And thank you, everyone in the comments for hanging out with us and creating space for us. And let's keep doing it.
Thank you. And thank you all for joining us.